The Imperial Guard, or Astra Militarum as it's known in High Gothic, is the first and often last line of defense for the some 1 million human-settled worlds of the Imperium. Generally drawn from the best the Imperium has to offer from its citizenry, the Guard is anything but inept, though the sheer scale of its battles and threat of its enemies can often force its casualties and defeats to be massive. Regardless, the average Imperial Guardsman is the backbone of the Emperor's forces, and without him or her, the Imperium would be entirely incapable of projecting and maintaining its power across known space. The Imperial Guard, though only officially formed during the Great Crusade, and even then under the name of the Imperialis Auxilia, actually has its roots sinking as far back into history as the Great Unification Wars on Terra, where the Emperor of Mankind first revealed himself to the fractured peoples of old Earth. Before the combined efforts of the Emperor, his perpetual allies, and their genesmiths could overcome the technological hurdles preventing them from creating the relatively genetically stable Space Marines, and even before the Thunder Warriors were first formed, before he could then replace them with the Adeptus Astartes, there existed a little-known regimental corps of more human, but still genetically enhanced soldiers known only as Genos. These gene-wrought troops had none of the extreme capabilities of the Thunder Warriors or the later Space Marines, and little is known of their own genetic stability. However, they were crafted from what the man who would come to be known as the Emperor had directly on hand. These warriors would initiate the Unification Wars, and would go on to form the core of what would later be known as the Imperial Army. It was perhaps from his experimentations on these troops that the Emperor would learn the first of what he required to later create the legions of genetically enhanced super soldiers, making them perhaps the missing link between mankind and the almost inhuman Thunder Warrior armies and Space Marine legions. It was not, however, until the midpoint of the Great Crusade that the official precursor to the Imperial Guard would be formed. Known as the Imperialis Auxilia, these proto-guardsmen were tasked with occupying and policing the worlds that the sons of the Emperor, the Primarchs, and their gene sons had brought into Imperial compliance. If you want to know more about the Primarchs and how they were created, please see our video on how the Primarchs were made, and just what happened between the Emperor and the Chaos Gods on the lost world of Moloch. Moving on from that, however, the Auxilia were also often tasked with cleaning up the aftermath of battles, and helping to rebuild the shattered remains of captured worlds, in order to speed up the advance of the Primarch-led forces, and to prevent the spreading thin of the legions. However, by the latter half of the Crusade, and as the number of planets the Imperium was engaged in open war with grew, it became clear that even the incredibly capable Space Marines simply lacked the numbers necessary to fight the required battles on all fronts. Over time, this led to the Imperialis Auxilia being tasked with more frontline duties, to include providing artillery and armor support. Eventually, the Auxilia would fight side by side with the legions as infantry, allowing the legions to slowly begin to adapt what is now their more commonly accepted role as precision strike forces, though this would still not fully become the case until after the breakup of the legions into the smaller chapters after the Horus Heresy. The Auxilia itself was not saved from reorganization following the heresy, however. Following the betrayal of the Emperor's most favored son, Horus Lupercal, and the mutiny of approximately half of all Imperial forces, the Imperial Army was divided into a number of smaller sub-factions and reorganized so as to prevent future turncoats from spreading their ideology much farther than a single Space Marine chapter or Guardsman planet. The Auxilia would now become the Imperial Guard in earnest, and would be forbidden from fielding anything but individual planetary units, and it is from these same planetary groups that the Imperial Guard now draws its hardened men. In times of relative peace, a concept that isn't entirely an existing or common one in the violent Milky Way galaxy, the Imperial Guardsmen are not just conscripted from Imperial planets without a thought and then pressed haphazardly into service. Though this may indeed happen if there is a massive conflict within a month's travel from their home planet, which is roughly 10,000 light years for the average Guard-operated spacefaring vessel. Almost all but the penal legions are given an adequate amount of training and equipment before being pushed off to the front lines. As was mentioned before, since the Horus Heresy, where mixed regiments were outlawed in order to make it harder to organize larger groups of traitorous men-at-arms, all Imperial Guardsmen have been exclusively grouped into planetary-derived regimental bodies. But aside from being responsible for providing troops to the Imperial Guard, an individual planetary governor of any civilized world is also expected to raise their own planetary defense force. Perhaps contrary to popular belief, the troops of these defense forces account for what could be assumed to be the average level of soldier in the Imperium. It is only after these defense forces have been proven to be inadequate that the greater in numbers and better funded and trained Imperial Guardsmen will be called in to help. This being said, Imperial Guardsmen themselves are actually initially recruited from these same planetary armies. And though these defense forces rarely see combat, and when they do they are often wiped down to almost the last man before seeing reinforcements, it is at least expected for a defense force to furnish to the Imperial Guard with what roughly ends up being their top 10% of soldiers. And though experienced wartime soldiers may not be something the average planetary defense force has in droves, given the terrestrially locked nature of such a force, the fact that there are statistically bound to be at least some physical and mental specimens above the norm among the large populations of Imperial worlds means that the Imperial Guard should be at least getting fresh recruits that are already a cut above the majority of humanity's stock. And that, in theory, they should be able to be trained into soldiers that far outshine the average rank and file of the armies of ancient Earth, who only had one planet to draw upon. It also doesn't hurt that it is considered a crime against the Emperor himself for a planetary governor to provide the Imperial Guard with undertrained, under-equipped, or incapable troops. Bearing all of this in mind, the Imperium is still drawing its forces from at times very different planets. The environment, politics, and even the economies of such worlds can drastically affect the mindset and capability of individual guard units. For example, troops drawn from death worlds, such as the Catachan jungle fighters, often tend to make up some of the most uncomplaining and suicidal seeming of all guardsmen. This is owed largely to the fact that life on all but the most horrific or chaos-corrupted battlefields is honestly not quite worse than the average day on a death world. And if it is, then it's not by much, at least as far as the death world or troops will tell you. That said, cultural factors also come into play when it comes to the raising up of a quality guardsman. When the people of Vestroia refused the call of the Adeptus Militarum, the sub-department of the Adeptus Administratum responsible for the conscription and levying of all Imperial troops, the Vestroians were actually met with a rare mercy when their argument that their people would be better suited producing weapons and arms for the Imperium, rather than wasting lives on a battlefield, was mostly accepted. This cowardice has become a point of great shared shame for the people of Vestroia, who now dedicate the firstborn son of every single family, whether commoner or noble, to their local Imperial Guardsman unit. These firstborns are trained from childhood, in the cold northern frontiers of Vestroia, to be lethal and hardy fighters, willingly subjecting themselves to environments and conditions almost as savage as any death world. The only difference is that they do so willingly, and with an instilled pride, rather than simply because they have no other choice. This harsh training allows the Vestroian firstborn, as their guard regiments have come to be known, to be among the best cold-weather troops in the Imperium. However, as dedicated as the Vestroians are, and even knowing the conditions that the Catachans face, there are those among the Guard who both hold cultural dedication to the Guard and who also hail from a death world. The Death Corps of Krieg is one of these groups, but it was not always known as such. In 433 M40, the world of Krieg declared independence from the God Emperor of mankind. It was not the Space Marine legions, or the greater Imperium of mankind, that would punish them, however, but instead their own people. By the orders of Colonel Jurten, a man who called Krieg home, the 83rd Krieg Regiment of the Astra Militarum would willingly unleash absolute nuclear devastation upon the entirety of their home planet in order to bring it back into compliance. Krieg is now an irradiated death world of human rather than natural making, and its soldiers have become specialists in siege warfare who seek to atone for the sins of their traitorous ancestors, but they are most certainly now, at the very least, compliant. That being said, even the most loyal and compliant of guardsmen regiments are not simply given free rein. Too great is the risk of corruption, and too aware of this is the Imperium. And perhaps the best way to keep a soldier fighting what's in front of them, at least for the short term, is for them to fear what's behind them much more. Or at least, this is the conclusion the Imperium has come to. The commissars of the Officio Prefectus serve as the link between the Astra Militarum and the Departmentum Munitorium, the official body responsible for the training and morale of the rank-and-file soldiers of the Imperium. Commissars are trained from a young age and are often plucked from the Scala Progninium, the subdivision of the Adeptus Ministerium, which is the state church of the Imperium, that is responsible for the raising of orphan noble children. And while many of the Scala's wards go on to serve various roles in the Adeptus Terra's vast organizations, the best and harshest of them, those who are simply unwavering in their upholding of discipline, instead become commissars. Officers of the Officio Prefectus are given a blanket permission to execute any grunt, NCO, or officer of the guard regiments that they are assigned to. They can at any time bring down judgment on a fleeing or faltering soldier and instantly decide who will take his place, though they will often simply move down the established chain of command until someone can meet their exacting standards, or until there is simply no one left to attempt to do so. It should be noted, however, that not all commissars are assigned to regular guard units. Some commissars are granted the rare honor of leading the Tempestus Scions of the Militarum Tempestus, also known as the Ordo Tempestus. Unlike the rank-and-file Imperial Guardsmen, whose training, tactics, and equipment rely heavily on their homeworld, the Scions of the Ordo Tempestus are drawn from the carefully mindscaped, instructed, and indoctrinated youth of the Scarlet Progenium. It is through these methods that the Ecclesiarchy carefully trains these war orphans into weapons of war themselves. These children are pushed hard, harder than any but perhaps the most elite of Deathworld Guardsmen, but they are also mentally groomed and fed every bit of tactical knowledge and ground tactics necessary to operate up to at least a platoon and company level. The result is a Special Forces unit capable of undertaking all but the most dangerous of tasks that only a Space Marine could handle, and even the lesser of those possibly, if the factoring for casualties isn't too great of a concern. And yet, for their might and training, the Militarum Tempestus, much like the Space Marines, simply cannot furnish the sheer numbers the Imperium needs to protect and police its million-plus worlds. That is a job that falls to the often underestimated and sacrificed rank-and-file Imperial Guardsmen. To live as an average Guardsman is indeed a thankless life. You are paid, but you're practically guaranteed to never get the shore leave to spend it. Additionally, you're likely going to be pushed from one planet to another, fighting day to day when you're not traveling through the warp, which is a whole different bag of worms. Thankfully, you're generally going to be doing combat with Rebel Defense Forces and mutinous hive worlds, rather than with Chaos Spawn, Xenos, or Traitor Legions. You can probably handle this for the most part too, seeing as you've actually seen combat, unlike your average enemy, and you have a lot more allies to your left and right, not to mention the logistics of the Department Militarum fully behind you. Even still, there is an often quoted statistic that the average life expectancy of an Imperial Guardsman is only 15 hours. This can be true if the battlefield is particularly horrific, but that's only for the worst of engagements. Like any army, the Guard has to have an NCO and Senior Officer Corps to function, and that just wouldn't be possible if this horrific fact was anything close to true. It's not actually totally uncommon for a Guardsman to survive his 20-year contract. If this happens, he's entitled to land on one of the worlds he's helped bring under Imperial rule, along with whatever amount of money he's saved over his career, which should be most of it for aforementioned reasons. It is perhaps not a massive percentage of troops that get to live to retirement. However, when you're fielding billions of men, even a small percentage of them is a large number. The Imperium actually does have enough retired Guardsmen that it uses to settle the often harsh worlds that it needs to build into functioning members of the Empire of Mankind. Regardless of how brutal the battles that the Guard takes place in can become, knowing this, there is at least a light at the end of the tunnel, if you can avoid a Rebel lasgun or Commissar's bolt pistol, and if you get lucky enough to not be one of the few sent in to combat a Hive Fleet or Chaos Marine chapter. In the end, for all their numbers of dead, for all that they are sacrificed like forgotten numbers on an accounting sheet, to see a veteran Guard unit take a world by storm is a sight to behold. A planetary-sized force of Guardsmen can easily black out the sky with artillery shells and indirect fire. Their line units, when well organized, can put down a literal wall of lasgun fire that will eviscerate almost anything in their path, if not with the first shot, then with the second that is coming quickly after it. In the end, the Guardsmen are generally very well trained, this is true. Still, they don't have to be Space Marines. They just need to be skilled and numerous enough to survive the precious minutes needed to point and fire their millions of weapons at the enemy, which often won't exist after the fact, or which will wish they didn't. Because while yes, many do underestimate the respectable quality of the Emperor's Guardsmen, quantity is its own multiplier of quality as well.